Some people just don't understand what they're getting into. If you move to a neighborhood with a lake, you can't complain about mosquitoes. If you choose to live near an airport, there's no point in getting upset about the noise of airplanes. And if you decide to buy a house next to a farm, guess what? There will be cows. But it seems this woman didn't get the memo. My family has had this farm for generations. It's a big, beautiful piece of land with open pasture, some crops, and, of course, cows. Lots of cows. Some dairy, some beef, all well cared for, happy, grazing quietly without disturbing anyone. At least, not until she came along. The woman moved in next door about 6 months ago. Her plot bordered part of my pasture, and from day one, I could tell she didn't like the idea of living near a farm. At first, I thought it was just a passing fancy. Some people take a while to get used to the smell of manure, the mooing, the movement of animals. But it soon became clear that she didn't want to get used to it. She wanted me to change. It started with silly complaints. One day, while I was fixing a fence, she appeared out of nowhere, arms crossed, wrinkling her nose. "Those cows make a lot of noise, don't they?" I shrugged and carried on with my work. "They're part of the farm. They've always been here." She let out a dramatic sigh, as if I'd just told her I wasn't going to do anything about a rat infestation in the kitchen. From then on, the complaints got worse and worse. She grumbled about the smell, about the mooing, about the fact that sometimes the cows would come close to her fence and stare. Yes, apparently my cows were nosy. But then came the moment when I realized that she was really going to be a problem. I was milking some of the milkers when my brother came in holding a sheet of paper and handed it to me. It was an official notification from the HOA. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, she called the damn HOA. The paper said that my cows were affecting the appearance of the community, and that residents had complained that the presence of the animals was devaluing the properties in the neighborhood. When I read that, all I could do was laugh. Firstly, because my farm existed long before these condominiums were built. Second, because my land was not part of the HOA. They had no authority over me. But apparently, this woman thought she did. And when she realized that I wasn't going to bend to her demands, she decided to take things to a whole new level. And that's when the war began. If there's one thing I've ever seen in my life, it's people who think they own the world. But this woman, she went further. After the first notification from the HOA, I completely ignored the nonsense. I wasn't part of the association, so their rules didn't apply to me. But apparently, this woman couldn't accept a simple no. A week later, I received another letter from the HOA. This time, the tone was more aggressive. They said that my property was negatively impacting the aesthetics of the community, and that the residents demanded action. Now, tell me, what the hell does aesthetics have to do with cows? Since when did a green pasture with well-kept animals become a problem? But this second letter was even more absurd. There was a list of demands. That's right, they had the nerve to list things I should do on my own land. Reduce the number of cows, as if it were a condominium limiting the number of cars per house. Build a wall to hide the animals from view. Ensure that the smell of the animals doesn't reach the other houses, as if I could install a giant exhaust fan in the sky to filter the air. I laughed out loud, but at the same time, I began to feel that irritation growing, because now it was no longer a question of a silly complaint. Now this woman was trying to impose her will on me, using the HOA as a weapon. What didn't she know? I wasn't going to back down. That same day, I personally went to the HOA headquarters, knocked on the door, and, as soon as someone answered, handed the letters back. "This doesn't apply to me," I spoke simply, looking the woman who answered right in the eye. "My land is not part of the HOA, and if you keep bothering me, I'm going to take this to court." She gave me the "I'm not being paid enough to deal with this" look and took the papers without arguing. But I realized that someone was listening to the conversation from across the hall. And of course, it was her. The woman who wanted my cows out of there appeared at the door like a demon out of the shadows. "This is absurd! You can't just ignore the welfare of the community." "Yes, I can." I crossed my arms. "My farm was here before any of you. If you don't like it, the door to the street is the door to the house." She was furious. She looked at me with that expression of someone about to freak out and stomped off without saying another word. I thought that would be the end of the soap opera, but I had underestimated this woman's level of madness. The next day, I started to notice strange things. First, someone put up signs in my pasture, right next to her house. The signs said things like polluted area and risk of contamination. I went there, tore them all down, and threw them away. But 2 days later, the signs were back. Then I realized that the cows were scared. Large animals are sensitive to change, and they were restless, looking at the fence as if something was wrong. I installed security cameras in that part of the land, and the next day, when I checked the recordings, the woman was throwing water over my fence with a hose. At first, I thought it was just some bizarre nonsense, but then I realized what she was doing, trying to soften the soil to make the fence fall. This was already the stuff of sick people. She couldn't force me to move my cows, so she tried to create a problem to make me spend money fixing it. Now, I was really angry, but it hadn't got to the worst yet, because when this woman realized that I wasn't going to give in, she decided to resort to terror. And that's when things really got out of hand. I knew this woman was crazy, but I didn't expect her to go that far. After all the failed attempts to force me to move my cows, letters, threats, fake signs, and even sabotage, it seemed that she had finally given up. For a whole week, total silence. No new complaints. No contaminated area signs. No hose trying to sink my fence. But I should have known that when an idiot disappears for a long time, it's because he's up to something even worse. Late one night, I was in the barn putting away some tools when I heard a strange noise coming from the pasture. A loud moo, followed by the sound of something moving fast in the grass. I immediately went out and got a flashlight. I walked over to the fence, and when I shone my light on the pasture, my blood boiled. My cows were completely restless. They were huddled in a corner of the paddock, some shaking their heads, clearly annoyed. But the worst was when I saw the ground covered in a strange white powder. I ran into the pasture and was terrified when I realized what it was. Someone had dumped industrial cleaner on the grass. Yes, chemicals, bleach, heavy detergent, maybe even some kind of poison. This woman had tried to poison my cows. The anger I felt at that moment was indescribable. She wanted to get rid of the animals so badly that she was now willing to kill them. The first thing I did was call the vet. Even though I didn't know exactly what that powder was, I couldn't risk it. He arrived quickly and helped me separate the animals to check them. Fortunately, none of the cows had eaten the contaminated grass. The strong smell probably made them avoid the place. But now it was personal. The next day, I went straight to the police station. I explained the situation, showed photos of the contaminated grass, and described all the previous incidents. The police officer who attended to me listened to everything, shaking his head slowly. "Do you have concrete proof that she did it?" he asked. "Ah, my friend, I did." I took out my cell phone and opened the recordings from the cameras I had installed on the fence. And there she was, with a gardening mask on his face, pouring a bag full of white powder directly into my pasture. The policeman was shocked. "She did this at dawn?" "She did." I crossed my arms. "And nearly killed my cows in the process." That was enough for the police to finally take action. A car was sent to the woman's house, and I was called to accompany them. When we arrived, she came out with that air of superiority, as if she was ready for another speech about the rules of the community. But when the policeman asked her to explain what she was doing throwing chemicals on my pasture, she paled. I was just trying to sanitize the area for the good of the community." The policeman narrowed his eyes. "So you admit that you dumped the product on the pasture?" She realized what a stupid thing she'd said and tried to correct herself, but it was too late. I watched the whole thing with my arms crossed, holding back a smile of pure satisfaction. The policeman continued, now in a more serious tone. You have the right to remain silent. Yes, she was being arrested. When he handcuffed that woman, the whole neighborhood came out to see what was going on. And the beautiful thing? No one was on her side. The neighbors who had previously avoided getting involved were now whispering among themselves, some even taking photos of the scene. The woman was put in the car, furious, screaming that she was a victim, that she just wanted a clean neighborhood, that I was a disgusting bumpkin who was ruining the community. And what about me? I just stood there, watching, savoring every second of her humiliation. But it wasn't over yet, because the arrest was only the beginning of the end for her. The day after that woman's arrest, the whole neighborhood already knew what had happened. People started commenting, and the story spread fast. The fact that someone had been arrested was reason enough to talk about it, but when the details came out, it got even more interesting. No one could believe that she had tried to poison cows. At first, some neighbors even tried to defend the woman, saying that it must have been a misunderstanding, that perhaps it wasn't that serious. But then the videos from the security cameras began to emerge. The recording of her throwing the chemical on the grass went viral among residents. Some people passed the images on to the neighborhood Facebook group, and soon everyone knew exactly what had happened. She went from annoying HOA woman to the criminal who tried to kill animals. The HOA, which until then had always protected her, tried to pretend it had nothing to do with it. They sent out a ridiculous note saying that they did not support the actions of individual members and that they were committed to maintaining the safety and harmony of the neighborhood. But nobody bought that excuse. She hadn't acted alone. The HOA knew about the threats. They helped put the pressure on, sent out notices, imposed non-existent fines, turned a blind eye to minor attacks. Now, with the woman arrested and the truth exposed, people began to question the association. And as the residents began to question, the house of cards began to crumble. First came complaints about abusive fines. People paid absurd amounts for ridiculous infractions, such as having a garbage can on the wrong side of the sidewalk, or planting flowers that didn't match the standard of the neighborhood. Then they started talking about the extra fees the HOA was charging, without anyone really understanding where the money was going. People started asking for records, demanding transparency about how the funds were being used. And, of course, when the HOA saw that the siege was closing in, they did the worst possible thing. They tried to ignore everything, but it was too late. The residents themselves started a movement to dissolve the association. And while all this was going on, I was making sure that the woman didn't escape justice. Even after being arrested, she still tried to play the victim. Her lawyer tried to argue that it wasn't an intentional attack and that she was just trying to sanitize the area. But nobody bought that story. The case against her went on, and when the day of the trial finally came, it was a real public humiliation. The judge watched the recordings, listened to the witnesses, and had absolutely no doubt that she was guilty. She was convicted of animal cruelty and trespassing. She got community service and a hefty fine, but that was only the beginning of her downfall. Because, in addition to the criminal conviction, I also sued her civilly. And when the judge handed down the sentence, it was clear that this woman was never going to recover financially. She was forced to pay for all the damage she had caused. The contaminated grass had to be replanted. The veterinary examinations of the cows had to be paid for. And, of course, she had to compensate me for the inconvenience. The amount was so high that she couldn't pay it. And then came the icing on the cake. She had to sell her house to pay off the debt. Yes, the woman who wanted to evict me from my own farm was now being evicted from her own neighborhood. Her moving day was quite a spectacle. The moving truck pulled up early, and they started loading her furniture. A few neighbors came out just to watch. No one said a word, but the silence was heavier than any comment. She tried to act as if nothing was happening, but you could see the embarrassment on her face. I, on the other hand, made a point of being there. I stood by the fence, watching my cows graze peacefully. From time to time, I threw feed to them, without taking my eyes off the scene. At one point, she looked at me, a look of pure defeat. I just smiled and nodded. She got into her car, slammed the door, and drove off without looking back. And just like that, the worst neighbor ever disappeared from my life. The HOA? 2 weeks after she left, the association was officially dissolved by the residents themselves. Without a leader to dictate the rules, without an authoritarian figure to force fines and collections, the people simply decided they didn't need it anymore. Now, the neighborhood is peaceful. People live their lives without anyone butting in where they don't belong. And my cows? Oh, they're still here, just like always. Because, in the end, the only person who didn't belong there was her. And if you agree with me, leave a like and comment on what you thought.